to sing African American music. It is not just a steady beat, but it's an emotional, get your whole body into it. And our wonderful Deacon Ruth is going to swing it on the piano, and we're going to sing Swing Low, Sweet Chariot in honor of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Awesome.
Please have a seat. Welcome, dear friends. My name is James Allgard. I'm pastor here at Grace Lutheran in Wenatchee. So welcome once again. We're glad that you came to experience a time of learning and reflection together as we consider the life of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'll pray an opening prayer, but I'll give a few orientation comments about our building. It doesn't look like it usually does. We have a renovation project just beginning, so for bathroom needs, I invite you to use the ones that are directly downstairs. There is also a bathroom trailer just on the front lawn, and that is open and available for you. Maybe that's it. Feel free to graze at our hospitality table, and let's go ahead and begin with prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Gracious God, we pray that you would infuse our lives with the Spirit of Christ, with courage, with faith, and with hope. We give thanks for Reverend Dr. Mark Rocker and his willingness to come and share some of his learnings with us and also guide us in a process of holy discernment, of holy conversation. We ask that you bless our thinking, our reflection throughout this weekend. In Jesus' name. Amen. And John.
Welcome. I'm John McQuaig. I'm on the council here at Grace Lutheran, and I picked up a New York Times bestseller book about probably 6-7 months ago, written by Metaxas on Bonhoeffer. And I had read Bonhoeffer's books years ago and had learned things from them, but hadn't heard too much about Bonhoeffer since that time. And I thought, now here's someone who could inspire a 600-page book, which was very intriguing. I mean, you could hardly put it down. I'm not sure I slept that week that I read it. And it could be a New York Times bestseller and still today, right? It would be relevant today. And so I talked to various people in the church while I was reading it. And a couple of them said, now, who's that again? Bonhoeffer. I think I've heard of him. And I thought, this is kind of strange. This is one of our real heroes of the Lutheran faith. He's become an unbelievable theologian from the last century that people didn't necessarily know. And so when I went to council, I said, what if we look at doing maybe a book study or something? And Pastor James said, well, I know someone who's a Bonhoeffer expert. Maybe we can get him to come and talk to us about Bonhoeffer. And I thought, well, that's a great idea. And so the next week I was in Sun River, Oregon. This kind of shows you how the Holy Spirit works. I was in Sun River, Oregon. We went to Sun River Christian Fellowship. And who was the preacher that week but Mark Brocker? And he was a substitute for that particular weekend. And then we saw him again a month later, and I was able to meet him then and suggest, and James had talked to him, and so he was very excited about coming. Now, this is a man who has studied Bonhoeffer his entire career, it appears to me. I mean, he's dedicated his life to Bonhoeffer. He's an ELCA pastor who recently retired. He told me he started at St. Olaf for a year, and then he went to PLU because St. Olaf had, 7 quarterbacks? Yeah, 6 quarterbacks, and so he thought there was a better chance of playing football at PLU. Yeah, okay, oh, good, we'll hear that story. So anyway, so he ended up at PLU, and then went to the Lutheran School of Theology in Chicago. Yeah, thank you. Recently retired professor from LSTC right here. And then ultimately to the Divinity School of Chicago. He got his PhD there. And I wrote this down just to make sure I had it straight. The title of his dissertation for his PhD. It's The Community of God, Jesus Christ and Responsibility, the responsible person and the responsible community in the ethics of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, that sounds like a major project to me. You've got, the only thing that's not in there is the Holy Spirit. I'm sure it worked in there somehow. But he's been an editor of many books on Bonhoeffer. He's also was the president of the International Bonhoeffer Society, so has a huge interest in it. But the other thing about him, when I heard him preach, I told him I can really recommend it because I didn't fall asleep at all during his sermon, and but either one of them. And he said, "Well, that's nice." But you have to understand that being ELCA pastors is kind of their family business, because his father, Frank Rocker, is a pastor. Your daughter's a pastor and son-in-law. Is that correct? And anybody else that I'm missing? That's it. Okay. Oh, okay. It goes on and on. So it's the family business. So he said when someone nods off during a sermon, they call it deep meditation. So anyway, we're really excited to have you here, and this should be a great morning. Thanks, Marty.
Well, thanks, Pastor James and John. Couple of quick things. The PLU story, I went to PLU, redshirted for a year, and then decided not to play. I'm not going to do the whole story, but because I decided not to play, PLU eventually won their first national championship. They found it. It was 1980 it would have been.
My son was on that team too.
Well, there you go. So I'm back. Eric Carlson ended up playing because Frosty went, because I was supposed to back up Frosty's son for several years, but he got Eric Carlson to come out and play, and Eric Carlson led him to a national championship his senior year. The other thing you have to sing, the song we were singing, Bonhoeffer was so influenced and enjoyed going to the Abyssinian Baptist Church. It must have been interesting to have this German professor type guy showing up at the Abyssinian Baptist Church. But then he took these spirituals back, and this Finkenwalde seminary that underground seminary that he led for a couple of years, those poor seminarians, because he'd want to listen to these spirituals and go, what's going on here? You know, they're just trying to figure this out. But that was a great way to start today, so appreciate that. I do thank you for the invitation to do a Bonhoeffer weekend like this. It's something I'm eager to do. And I also want to just commend Pastor James and John and the people of Grace for sensing Bonhoeffer's relevance for us today. And so we'll be talking about that more. If by chance you notice, if you look really close, you may notice some stuff on this side of my face. I didn't fall off my bike because I didn't quite get on it, but I spilled off it on Monday, and I was going to tell you that I took one for the team in defense of democracy, but no, I just went and fell off my bike, and I was so glad that nothing more serious, so I'd be able to show up, and it's actually healing up well, but that's the story about that. I did provided a brief bio for you. It's hard when you come together like this for a Bonhoeffer weekend. Some people have read about him or know more about him, and others less, but I wanted you to have some basic bio before we entered in, so that's why we provided that for you. There is as mentioned to John, there's a wonderful documentary. There's several that have been done of Bonhoeffer, but there's a wonderful documentary that was produced in 2003 by Journey Films on Bonhoeffer, but it's an hour and a half long, and so that's why this is to at least give you some basic understanding of who he was, and then it'll make more sense than what I have to say today. I do want to just say, she may make a remark every so often, but my wife Donna is with me there. Donna, wave your hand. Okay. What do you have to say, Donna?
Sometimes you can be kind of boring.
That's why I teach Bonhoeffer. You want to make sure you have somebody exciting to teach about.
One time he was preaching, we have 3 kids and 3 adopted African orphans, but one of them, the youngest one, said he was preaching. He only goes about 10, 12 minutes because that's about the time between commercials on TV. So he figures that's how people much thinking. Oh. Anyway, she turned to me and she said, when is he going to be done? He just goes on and on.
That may not be the last time we hear from Donna while we're here. So the strategy for the workshop is I'm going to do a presentation in the first hour. We'll be able to have a break, at least a 10-minute break or so between the two parts. And I'm going to be presenting, you have the outline there. If The outline's for your benefit. Sometimes it bothers people to follow along on it. If you're better off just listening, do that. But it's then you have it, so you have some stuff there for you. And there's 2 or 3 key quotations that I wanted to make sure you had to take with you today. So that's the outline. And I'm going to work very closely from this outline. It's based on a paper I presented in January at the 14th International Bonhoeffer Congress. And this one was held in Sydney, Australia. It's really interesting. There's the English language section includes people from Australia, South Africa, Great Britain, New Zealand, and as well as the United States and Canada. So it's a widespread group. And then, of course, Germany, the Netherlands, there's a number of other countries that have Bonhoeffer groups in them. But this is based on that paper I presented there on this theme of with courage and humility, Bonhoeffer's ethical approach for us today. Then the second hour, and I didn't know how many people we would have. Frankly, I'm a bit amazed by the turnout today because I know they didn't know who I was. So the interest is in Bonhoeffer, just in this theme that this is something that people are really wrestling with. So it's great to see this many people here. But we're going to do a case study. It's a case study about a covenant church in Detroit. I thought I'd pick something far away, so to speak, for us to do a case study on. But I think you'll find it helpful. And what I wanted to do was do a case study with a method that's inspired by Bonhoeffer's approach to ethics. It's not the method he explicitly developed for us, but I wanted to give you something specific to work on. We'll have some additional handouts for that, and you'll end up working for at least 15, 20 minutes at table groups. So we'll need to make sure during that time that everybody's connected with a table group for that, and then we'll do some stuff together for that. So that's the strategy. Before I get started, the other thing I want to do is to present a gift to Grace Lutheran. I don't know if you might have this already, but this is a gift to my book. It's called Coming Home to Earth. And I'll just, it says, Dear people of grace, may God fill you with a deep and abiding love of our earth home and all its inhabitants. Blessings, Mark. This isn't, Bonhoeffer influenced this. It's not on Bonhoeffer per se, but Bonhoeffer certainly influenced this effort. And we do have one of the people that actually wrote something that goes on the back of the book saying why this is a good book to read. Well, she happens to be here, Barbara Rossing. She's even got a copy there. So I'll read what she wrote because I think it's helpful. Brocker shows us how to find God here on earth as a homecoming. Coming home to earth counters childhood anxiety, mine, about going to heaven with wonderful homecoming images, from salmon migration to the biblical prodigal son, from Kenya's tree planting greenbelt movement to Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Martin Luther. Brocker shares astute pastoral insights through his own journey home to earth, including the surprising environmental legacy of a Republican governor. I love this book. That governor was Tom McCall, and we're talking about heroes of the faith. Tom McCall was in high school, my first political hero, the governor of Oregon. And so I appreciated you putting that in there.
Thank you.
There we go. You bet. So let's get started then. This will be a bit of a workout. But Bonhoeffer was a German scholar, and obviously is known by many because of what he did and what happened to him with his execution. But this will be a workout working through this. But one of my goals, there's actually a book that is emerging. We'll see if it finally gets published. But I'll focus on this particular theme. And my goal in that book is to make Bonhoeffer's ethics as accessible as possible to what I call thoughtful lay people, the kind of group like this kind of group that would gather. And so, in effect, we'll be doing this today. I hope you get a lot out of it. But I'm hoping you're helping shape a book to come, all right, as part of the process here. This is part of the process. I lead an Oregon Bonhoeffer seminar. It's called Once a Month by Zoom now. We're on Zoom, and we have now have some people from around the country and even one guy from the Philippines that's part of that. But we're working through the chapters of that book that I envision this year. That's the goal of this. So this is this, in a sense, is I'm sharing with you stuff that we're literally working on right now as part of this Oregon Bonhoeffer seminar. So Bonhoeffer tends to be best known for his bold, courageous involvement in the conspiracy against Hitler. But he's especially relevant for us today, to me, is how Bonhoeffer's ethical approach combines courage and humility. You need to be courageous enough to engage in responsible action when compelled by a concrete situation, but at the same time be humble enough to let God be the judge. And we need to trust that God will carry forward what needs to be carried forward and leave behind what needs to be left behind. So first, I want to focus on Bonhoeffer's appeal for ethical humility. And this appeal is grounded in what he calls a miracle of divine mercy. So God's deep love for the world is the firm theological ground for Bonhoeffer's ethical approach. So this is a ethical approach grounded in the gospel. It's grounded in what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. Clearly the theological foundation for him. Bonhoeffer and other leaders grieved the destructive path that Hitler and his Nazi cohorts were leading the nation down. And so in the midst of the carnage of World War II and the Holocaust, imagine this, in the midst of that, Bonhoeffer affirmed the central message of the New Testament that in Christ God has loved the world and reconciled it with himself. And he's not talking, he was so strong on that God loves the real world, and that means the lost and condemned world, or we might say that the world with all its sins and shortcomings, that's the world that God loves, not some dream world or ideal world. And he refers to this, he actually uses that phrase as a miracle of divine mercy. And then one of my favorite quotations from those pages in Ethics is, no part of the world, no matter how lost, there's no part of the world, no matter how lost, no matter how godless, that has not been accepted by God in Jesus Christ and reconciled to God. The focus of ethics, then, is to participate in this divine miracle. God's self-revelation in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus teaches us to love as God first loved us. Bonhoeffer is confident that even flawed, limited human beings can participate in what he calls Christ's greatness of heart. The focus then in ethics is on what he calls discerning the will of God. And so he, right up front in ethics, in the new edition of ethics, it says, in doing ethics, the key question is not how can I be a good person, or how can I be good, or how can I do good. These are the questions we tend to ask, but that's not the focus, he said. These are futile attempts, he says, to justify ourselves. Now, Bonhoeffer does come out of a Lutheran tradition. He's actually part of the old Prussian Union Regional Church in Germany, which was both Lutheran and Reformed tradition. But he was Lutheran in the sense, in the Lutheran tradition, we talk about we're justified by grace through faith. We're justified by God. And so what would be the primal sin for a good Lutheran? Be self-justification. And so he's really challenging ethics where that's what we tend to do. Trying to say, I want to know, I don't only want to do what I feel called to do or discern what God's calling me to do. I want to know I did the right thing, or I want to know that that person did the wrong thing. He's really challenging that focus in ethics where we try to justify ourselves. And he lifts up the example of Adam and Eve, who engaged in a futile attempt to secure the knowledge of good and evil. Mentioned Genesis 3, 1-7, that Genesis account of Adam and Eve. And they're not satisfied with God knowing good and evil and think certain good and certain evil, absolute good, absolute evil. It says there that they wanted to be like God, knowing good and evil. In effect, they were refusing to accept their human limits, and they say they lacked ethical humility. Bonhoeffer asserts that the will of God has already been fulfilled in this miracle of divine mercy, and the focus of ethics then is to participate in this fulfilled will of God, to participate in God's deep love for the world, and that God's deep love for the world is realized among us too. He wants to stress that this happens among us. We might say another way of saying that, it's made real in and through us in our daily lives. It's made real in and through us in our daily lives. Discerning the will of God is an ongoing process. And so he makes a point that the will of God does not naturally imprint itself on the heart. It may be, in fact, he says at times it may be deeply hidden in many competing possibilities. Now, as he's writing this too, he can't come right out and just tell all the details of what he's involved in necessarily. So he's writing the ethics too, I think in 40, 41, 42. He ends up going to prison in 43, but it's in those early years of World War II is when he's working on the ethics that we have before us. And so he's really struggling to find his way during that time. And so when he's talking about many competing possibilities, it's not just about that, but that's what he's experiencing while he's writing on this. He said that discerning the will of God can be new and different in each given situation. So you really have to pay attention to the situation. And he says heart, intellect, observation, experience all have a role to play in this process of discernment. And then he uses this phrase, you need an intensely sober attitude employing the full range of human abilities. So this is where you use everything at our disposal to do our, I use a plain term, he doesn't say this, but our ethical homework. There's homework when it comes to discerning the will of God and some of the toughest issues we have to wrestle with. There's homework that we have to do and to take this intensely sober attitude toward it. Now, in terms of carrying out the will of God, he talks about engaging in responsible action. So again, you mentioned my dissertation. That's what I was focusing on, this concept of responsibility in Bonhoeffer's ethics. And we participate then in the realization of the will of God by engaging in responsible action. Gives a definition of responsible action as action on behalf of or in the place of others without expectation of return. So this is where we engage in what we sense God's calling us to do, and then we may hope for how people respond, but we do it because it's what we sense that God is calling us to do. Ethical humility, he says, is built into the structure of the responsible life. So he makes the point, responsible persons are free to live and make decisions. That's just part of being a human being, a responsible human being. We're free to do that. But that freedom is conditioned by our obligation to God and neighbor. And I cite in the footnote down there, Galatians 5:13, that chapter 5 of Galatians where it talks about our freedom. We're free in as much as we're loving God and loving the neighbor. And when we're not loving God and not loving our neighbor, we're not free. That's the concept of freedom he's working with here. He lifts up Jesus as what he calls the responsible person par excellence. Jesus gave himself completely on behalf of others. He demonstrated ethical humility. How? By taking the guilt of all human beings upon himself, by dying a humiliating death on the cross. And he really strongly emphasizes that Jesus did not shun the guilt of other human beings. And even makes the point that seeking to maintain personal innocence actually cuts us off from Jesus. Going back to those questions, when we're so focused on being good or doing good, wanting to have done the right thing, and that kind of focus, he actually says that cuts us off from Jesus. It doesn't connect us with Jesus, it cuts us off. So Jesus is willing. Another way to look at this is Jesus is willing to carry out the mission that he was given in a world where there is sin and evil and so on, because he doesn't try to avoid that community of people, that sinful world. Jesus enters into it fully. That's why he lifts that up in terms of Jesus being a responsible person par excellence. Real innocence, then, he said, is a willingness to enter the community of guilt, to not keep our hands clean, so to speak. Still, we're going to talk about, yes, we want to do what God's calling us to do. We want to discern the will of God, but we recognize that we're doing that in a difficult context, especially in the toughest issues we have to deal with. We're willing to be part of that community of guilt and acknowledge that we're part of it. So another point, Jesus We cannot, as human beings, have an absolute or certain knowledge of history. And the ethical task then is to do our homework and discern the will of God as best we can. I've been talking about that already. So doing our homework entails consideration of the full matrix of ethical factors, so motives, consequences, values, general human conditions, principles, and so on. So take a phrase like in ethics, the end justifies the means. We need to pay attention to ends, and we need to pay attention to means, and sometimes it's going to be hard to figure how they go together, but that's what it means to be a responsible human being, is to have to work through those kinds of things. And on the tough issues, this sounds goofy maybe, but the reason tough issues are tough is because they're tough. But we still as human beings need to figure out how to respond in those situations, and we'll talk more. I'm going to talk more about where God's grace comes in as we work through this process, but we will be getting to that. There's no foolproof rule for action to hide behind. Bonhoeffer was highly critical of what he called one principle thinking, ethical thinking. And so, where's that rule? If I just follow this rule, then I'll know I'm doing the right thing. Now, one word about this. If, one of my children, when they were growing up, they're 7 years old, and they said they took something that was not theirs, I would just say, no, you're stealing, and that would decide the matter at that point. You don't just so this isn't to throw out all the rules, but it's to recognize that when we get into some of the tougher issues, that the rules, one rule may suggest going this way, another rule suggests going that way, and that's why we struggle with certain issues. And those they can be in our personal lives. We can struggle as a whole society with them, a whole world with certain issues, because they just are very difficult. So he is critical of any partial response approaches to ethics. He distinguishes his ethics of responsibility from the big word that I learned in PLU was from teleological ethics, that tends to focus on consequences, and then from deontological ethics, which focuses on motives. If you like studying all that stuff, Kant, of course, is the classic thinker for deontological ethics and trying to find a rule that you could count on, a fundamental moral principle. Finally, then, what we need to do is to observe, judge, not ultimate judgment, but we do need to make some judgment about what to do, to weigh those factors, to decide and act. That's what's involved in engaging in responsible action. Then I want to move to a case study in ethical courage and humility, and use Bonhoeffer himself and what so many people have been drawn to him or wondered about him because of his involvement in this conspiracy against Hitler. By the way, there was more than one conspiracy, an attempt to assassinate Hitler. So I've gone more from, at times I used to read just the conspiracy. Well, no, it's a conspiracy, but we're talking about the conspiracy he was involved in, which was a major conspiracy. His involvement in this conspiracy against Hitler, Bonhoeffer referred to it as an extraordinary situation of ultimate necessities. Big word. But it's something beyond the normal flow of life, daily life. It's not even just a tough issue in life. This is one that just doesn't fit into any obvious pattern. We appreciate his boldness and courage, and people find it very compelling that he would be willing to do this. And the sacrifice of his life has certainly been a powerful witness in our time, and John was even commenting on that. This has been a witness to many, many people. What's striking is that Bonhoeffer himself sought to avoid justifying his actions, even in that situation where you've got Adolf Hitler was perceived by him and others, not everyone, but many others, as an evil leader. That's how he tended to be viewed. But even in that situation, Bonhoeffer sought to avoid justifying his actions. Bonhoeffer would have accepted the charge that his response was a tardy one. And I'm sharing here's insights from Eberhard Bethge, who was his student, his best friend, ended up being his best friend, a confessing partner, a co-conspirator, though Bethge wasn't Didn't have to pay the price with his life for that. But he was also his biographer. You read Bethke's biography was 1,000 pages on Bonhoeffer. It's one of the classic biographies in Western history, I suppose I would say. But Bethke's the one that shared some of these reflections based on his conversations with Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer said it's one thing to give an account of one's actions, but it's another thing to justify one's actions. You can give account. Here's why I'm doing what I'm doing, but justifying again, and I'm repeating this again and again, that's a form of ethical arrogance. The responsible action in Bonhoeffer's view is not to take this action into his own hands before, during, and after his actions. Only God could ultimately judge what he and others had done. He felt compelled to act as he did, but only with a profound sense of ethical humility. Now, one thing we need to resist is the temptation for extraordinary responsible action in a situation like that to be the measure of all action. And there has been some tendency for people to lift it up in that way. Bonhoeffer also makes the point, we're not always like, and this is a quotation, Hercules standing in perpetuity at a crossroads, struggling to forever make the right decision, someone worn out by conflicting duties, again and again failing and starting anew. So not all of life is like that. In fact, he says we're free to be human before God, eating, drinking, sleeping, working, and playing without interrupting those activities. There's no question that we're permitted to sleep, eat, work, and play. We don't have to question all the time, every minute of the day, if we have more urgent duties to do. So if you're you're having to take care of the kids, you're going to be a parent that day. And you don't have to psych out every last decision you're making during the day. Something could emerge that requires careful thinking and so on, but it's not like that all the time. We have certainly divinely commissioned tasks, which Bonhoeffer referred to as mandates. That word, when I do teach ethics, I just like to use the word responsibilities and abilities to respond. But he used the word mandates, work, marriage, government, and church. So responsible parents act on behalf of and in place of their children. That's what their task is. A responsible law enforcement officer would act, or law enforcement officers would act on behalf of the citizens of a community. And then there's certainly a time and place to evaluate how we're doing in fulfilling those mandates. But hopefully, when things are going reasonably well, we don't have to make decisions like Bonhoeffer and others had to do in dealing in this conspiracy that they were a part of. In the more ordinary flow of life, God does not want us to engage, as he says, in self-tormenting and hopeless question about the purity of one's motives, suspicious self-observation, the blazing and wearisome light of ceaseless conscious awareness. Now, having said that, this is Bonhoeffer acknowledges that there are exceptional moments of crisis. And in such exceptional moments, there's no law to hide behind. One must decide as a free venture, without being necessarily absolutely clear what needs to be done. We may even need to acknowledge that the law is being broken. So, for example, Bonhoeffer was committing treason, and he knew that. You try to assassinate the head of state, you are committing treason. That is by definition treason. A commandment may even need to be broken out of dire necessity. And Bonhoeffer was very clear, yes, we're trying to stop Hitler, but we are also murdering somebody. So we are breaking the commandment, you shall not kill. At that point, though, Bonhoeffer finally reached the point where he could see no other options to stop the catastrophe being perpetrated by Hitler and the Nazis. And so at that point, he made the decision to put his life and reputation on the line. And I'll have a little more to say about this tonight at the lecture, but Bonhoeffer, he wasn't the guy that was going to pull the trigger. In fact, Bethke said he had no idea what to do with a gun or whatever, but he was clearly implicated by being involved in this conspiracy, and I will have, again, more to say on that. Not today, this morning with what we're doing, but tonight when we look at the political responsibility of the church. So then this whole idea of what does it mean to let our gracious God be the judge? In approaching ethics the way Bonhoeffer did, we can count on God's love through the whole process, The ultimate judge of our actions is a God who loves us. It's very, very important for the way he approaches ethics. We're aware that in discerning the will of God and engaging in responsible action, human beings have a limited point of view in history. And this is one of the most important passages in his ethics. I'll just read it for you there, but it's printed also for you. Responsible action takes place in the sphere of relativity, completely shrouded in the twilight that the historical situation casts upon good and evil. It takes place in the midst of the countless perspectives from which every phenomenon is seen. Responsible action must decide not simply between right and wrong, good and evil, but sometimes between right and right or wrong and wrong. And I think he viewed what he was involved in the conspiracy as choosing between wrong and wrong. Through a thorough discernment process frees us to make real decisions. The divine will is accomplished through our discernment, decision-making, and acting. And God can even work through our irresponsible actions. And he lifts up this example of Judas, that Judas played a role in all of this. And there's others that could be cited, but Pilate too, I suppose you could say. God can work through even irresponsible actions. And what this means is we can give up anxiety about our own goodness, certainty of what is good and what is evil, and the ultimate justification of what we have done. That's simply not our responsibility as human beings. We can let our gracious God be the judge. The essential characteristic of responsible action, it says, is the ultimate ignorance of one's own goodness or evil and a dependence on God's grace, on God's love for us. We do not appeal to a fundamental moral principle or an ideology or some other moral factor to justify our action. PLU philosophy class, I still remember every week. It was moral philosophy, it was a good class, but every week we would have a different ism and try to figure out what the fundamental moral principle was for that ism. Now, all that's still helpful if you put it all together, but with those fundamental moral principles were also ethical shortcuts. You wanted something so you'd know you were doing the right thing. And that was the tendency in that approach to ethics. Once we have done our ethical homework, made a decision, and acted, we surrender our actions to God the moment it's carried out. We willingly take on any guilt, but we do not wallow in our guilt. Once the responsible action is carried out, we need a humble, hope-filled trust that God will make the divine will known. Profound mystery of history, and then quoting from him and from his ethics, precisely those who act in the freedom of their very own responsibility see their activity as flowing into God's guidance. Free action recognizes itself ultimately as God's action. Decision is God's guidance. The venture is divine necessity. And freely surrendering the knowledge of our own goodness, the good of God occurs. And so again, we are called to be courageous enough to engage in responsible action and humble enough to let our gracious God be the judge of our actions. God's love is not contingent on us getting everything right. And we trust that God who judges our actions is a God who loves us. Now, getting in a little more trouble here, I hope not, but maybe some. Bonhoeffer's ethical approach for us today, some key insights. There may be a need for a red flag political warning. In the Pacific Northwest, we're highly alert to red flag warnings. A red flag warning means conditions are right for extreme fire weather in the next 24 hours. High temperatures, low humidities, and strong winds, and one spark can ignite a highly destructive fire. I was just talking to John. My parents live in Sun River. He mentioned he'd been to Sun River Christian Fellowship. When I was there in September, we had a level 2 fire evacuation alert in Sun River. First one that anybody could remember. It's kind of amazing. There hasn't been one before, but hadn't been. My mom had neck surgery on a Monday, got home from the hospital on Tuesday, and later that afternoon, we got this level 2 evacuation alert. And so even though she's first day recovering, she had to help figure out what we needed to put together. Level 2 means either you evacuate or you're ready to evacuate in a moment's notice. So we never did evacuate, but we were ready to go. So that's part of our life in the Northwest, and certainly you have fires up in this area too. I just driving through Blewett Pass, I'm going, whoa, fire in here could be a real problem. Hopefully there won't be one, but that it could be one. My point would be we may need a red flag political warning. Now, I grew up during the civil rights movement in the Vietnam War years, and the nation struggled with deep political and social divisions. But we never experienced, I never experienced a nation as divided as it is today. Prominent historians have said this, that we're more divided than any time since the Civil War. Conditions may be ripe for extreme and destructive political behavior, and it may not take much to trigger a political conflagration. One major factor in all this is the lack of ethical humility among so many American citizens. Bonhoeffer's appeal for ethical humility calls into question those too certain of their ethical goodness or rightness. And I could say on the right or the left on this. Bonhoeffer cautions followers of Jesus who are overly confident in their ability to discern the will of God. So yes, we do our homework, we do the best we can, but we can become overly confident that we know what the will of God is. There's a tendency for Christians in the United States to occupy what Bonhoeffer refers to in book Life Together as the proud throne of the judge, where we can somehow stand apart and look down and make judgments on what's going on. Once again, Bonhoeffer encourages followers of Jesus to act with boldness and courage, but always at the same time with a strong dose of ethical humility. Now, we may be on the cusp of an extraordinary situation. That's possible. We'll see. But in the meantime, we need to fulfill our ordinary responsibility as a citizen and vote. Voting is, and that's an ordinary responsibility for us as American citizens. In Oregon, we just got our ballots. We do all vote by mail there. I don't know. Washington, we all vote. Yeah, you guys gone that. I don't know. You don't follow Oregon on everything. You know, that's. Anyway, voting by mail works out here in the Northwest, as far as I can tell. But it's been controversial, you know. But we got our ballots. Our ballots arrived on Thursday. And we decided we don't want to just vote quickly before we come. So you may even help shape our voting that we do when we get back to Oregon on next week. A second issue then, and again, these are some insights, not to resolve these things, but to show how this approach can impact how we think about certain things. Learning to live within our ecological limits. So for Bonhoeffer, the overwhelming crisis was the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. And he was appalled by the prevailing silence of church and weak response of the church and the weak response to Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. And Bonhoeffer wasn't a bishop. So what he was looking for was something from the official leaders of the church at that point. Bonhoeffer's involvement in the conspiracy against Hitler was, in a sense, was a desperate response to him seeing where the church was not stepping up enough. And the church did step up. So, and I'll be talking about this tonight. They did step up, but he became disillusioned. He didn't think it was a strong enough response. The overwhelming crisis of our time, and people might disagree with this, that would be part of a discernment process, but is the impending ecological catastrophe. Now, I myself tend to prefer incremental change. As a pastor, I tend to lead in that way, where you do small changes over time and they emerge, working with a congregation of people, and I prefer that. The difficulty with, potentially with the ecological catastrophe would be that incremental change is not enough. That it just may not be enough. And it's also then silence on this issue and a failure to act boldly and courageously is likely to have catastrophic consequences for the whole Earth community. And we may already be seeing some of those consequences. Those who profess to follow Jesus have opened ourselves to the charge that what we have done thus far is not a good response, but a very tardy response. One key factor is our lack of humility as human beings. We have resisted our God-given limits. God intends these limits actually for our well-being and the well-being of the whole Earth community. We cannot violate these God-given limits with impunity if we are to responsibly address the ecological crisis. And then the final section here, the path forward. Knowing that the judge of our actions is our gracious God who loves us, Bonhoeffer asserts to his fellow conspirators, and after 10 years, this essay he wrote about 4 months before he was imprisoned. It was Christmas time, 1942. Wrote it for Eberhard Bethke and a couple of the actual leaders of the conspiracy that he was a part of. And he talks there about accepting our co-responsibility for history. He dismisses the notion of going down heroically convinced of our own goodness. And that he says is actually non-heroic because it does not dare look into the future. So it's not just about being heroic. I mean, we want people to do courageous things like he was willing to do, but that's not the main point. The main point is he says the ultimately responsible question is how will the next generation go on living? We need to trust that the God who loves us dearly will judge our responses, and that God will carry forward what needs to be carried forward and leave behind what needs to be left behind. And then he adds a final insight in this section of that essay. He says, listen to the younger generation. Their future is at stake. And one thing I have said, even in the book I write, for my generation and older, we'll just say, so I'm 67. If for whatever reasons we're not ready to lead in addressing these issues that are before us, then at least we can get out of the way and let our young people lead us on certain issues, and because they see what's happening. Many of them do, and so we may need to let them provide leadership for us on things that for whatever reason, we're not going to be the leaders on. One other thing, Bonhoeffer loved something called the daily texts. It was the Moravian Church produces this. He had a bit of pietism in him. And the daily text for today, in German it's called Losungen, but that's when you'll see him referring to these texts. When you read about him or read his stuff, you wonder, what's he talking about? He's talking about the daily text. They've been produced since 1731, and there's always an Old Testament verse and a New Testament verse for each day. And it was very much a part of his devotional life, the seminary that he led for Finkenwalde Seminary. But this morning, this is what the Old Testament verse was. Even when I am old and gray, do not forsake me, my God, till I declare your power to the next generation, your mighty acts to all who are to come. And then the New Testament was about Anna. There was also a prophet, Anna. She was a widow to the age of 84. She never left the temple, but worshiped there with fasting and prayer night and day. At that moment, she came and began to praise God and to speak about the child to all who were looking for the redemption of Jerusalem. I just thought it was interesting to see those texts for today when I looked at them. I hadn't looked at them before. I wrote the lecture before that. Let's take about 10 minutes. If you have a comment or a question, something you want to make, just raise your hand and I'll recognize you. If you would mind, just stand and talk as loudly as you can. Tonight we are going to have a microphone, but right now, and I'll repeat a question if you have one so that the people know what I'm responding to. Anybody have a comment or question? Go ahead.
It seems to me that what you're saying is he was very thoughtful about his response to what he was going to do.
Yeah.
And we live in a day and age where people are very emotional and quick to become angry about the response.
Yeah.
He seemed that he was, rather than making a knee-jerk reaction, he was very thoughtful about his walk with God and what his response would be to the threat that he perceived.
Yeah.
And we live in a generation where people just go off.
Yeah.
And rather than what does God want me to do, what's the right thing to do, I just become angry and I react.
Yeah. No, thanks. I think we could hear that. Very, very helpful comment. Here's what I would add to it. There were also people that just reacted emotionally in that time, Nazi Germany, not surprisingly. And I think one of the geniuses of not just Hitler, but Hitler and some of the other Nazi leaders, they understood how big a factor that was if you want to sway people. and they were good at that. But being thoughtful is exactly what he was trying to get people to be, was to be more thoughtful in the process. But I have to say, Bonhoeffer was not necessarily, even in the confessing church, the church that resisted the Nazi inroads into the life of the church, even there, Bonhoeffer he was a young guy, and they dismissed him as a young radical at times. He was just too far out ahead of us. And I'll talk about tonight when he critiqued the Barmen Declaration, which was a statement, strong statement against the Nazi inroads into the life of the church. But he said, where's anything about the treatment of the Jews in this thing? It's silent on that. And so he was very critical of that. But so that it becomes another, if you take Bonhoeffer seriously, did he not pay enough attention to the role of emotions in the discernment process? So it may be that sometimes we have to take seriously. And so even Bonhoeffer's own approach to ethics would say that you have to take, if that's a reality, that emotions are controlling people now, then we have to look, okay, how does that affect how we go about making ethical decisions in our time? Because that's, again, it's not a perfect world we're dealing with. You have to deal with the actual world and the actual community and society you're dealing with. Here and then here, and then here.
You mentioned faith involvement a couple of times, and I may be here to talk about it tonight, but I'm not sure everybody's going to come to every lecture.
Yeah, right.
So when I was a young staff member at Golden Village, we read Bonhoeffer's Life Together and really talk about discerning in community, like the Finkenwalde Seminary model. Can you say a little more about Finkenwalde and the role of community in discernment?
Yeah. So Finkenwalde, this is the confessing church, in order to educate pastors, needed to start 5 of these, we call them underground or illegal seminaries, because of steps the Nazis were taking to inhibit the confessing church. So Bonhoeffer was one of the people chosen to be a director of this. Finkenwalde is the one that Barbara mentioned. And so the whole process of education and then daily worship life, meditation on texts, and so on. So that was that effort that he was involved in. And Life Together is a book that talks about, is based on his experiences there. Although he hoped that other communities that might not be just like, that was a very intense community, would also develop, what's the way of life that's a life together for the people of Grace Lutheran? What does that look like in your situation would be the question to ask. In terms of collaborating, in terms of the discernment process, that's what I advocate. We're actually going to do an exercise in that for the second hour here, where we're working together on that. But I did have Ted Peters, retired professor from PLTS, and basically one time I actually was part of a presentation for it was a celebration of clinical pastoral education at Emmanuel Hospital in Portland. He was one of the speakers. This doctor from the University of Washington was there, and I was included because I had gone through the CPE program there, so I was included. And I talked much about what I've presented here and the importance of working together and collaborating, being thoughtful, as you're saying, and that process. And Ted didn't pat me on the head, but he just basically said, I don't want to throw, maybe he said like cold water on my young colleague here, but he said, it really comes down to power. And he had worked on the Genome Project, and he saw in the political realm how power and money can control things. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that as people of faith and in communities that we should not work on collaborating together, thinking through things together, being respectful of one another, having a sense of ethical humility. I would still argue for that. But again, just like emotions are so much of a factor, the reality of power and money, those are things we have to be aware of when we're engaged in actual situations in the world. Bonhoeffer got to the point where he didn't just become a conspirator overnight. That comes at the end of he didn't live a long time, but it's a process of even getting to the point where he'd get involved in something as radical as that. So we had a comment here.
So would you please comment on Dietrich Bonhoeffer's ethical courage and humility in this move that he makes from the safety of New York City to London and then to Germany, going back into the mouth of the lion?
Yeah, well, I will, Ken, you may not be here tonight, but with his decision to go back in 1939, he made the decision to go back the United States. He was only in New York. He was in New York for a year in 1930-31 at Union Seminary. So that's 1 year he was there. But he goes back because people at Union, they wanted to save him. I mean, they could see what was happening, and so they brought him to New York. He might have ended up having a nice long teaching career. Might have been at Lutheran School of Theology as a professor. Maybe he'd have been teaching a class as a retired professor when I was there. You never know. But they wanted to save him from that. But he just felt, he said, unless I'm summarizing here, but unless I'm part of what's going on in Germany now, I'm not going to be able to be a trusted voice in the rebuilding of Germany after the war. And so he felt he had to go through that with the German people and be part of it rather than staying in the safety of New York. So that is courage, but the humility part also is, you're trying to find your way. And it's not like he was actually certain. If you read his diary from when he was in the United States, making this decision to go back, this is not a guy that's totally convinced he knows exactly what he's doing. He's trying to find his way. And sometimes you look back at it and we see him, for what he did, but he struggled at times. Just quickly, the book that I hope will emerge, I have written a draft of the first chapter, and it goes through 8 decisions that Bonhoeffer made in his life, starting with the decision that he wanted to become a theologian, which he made at 14. And his family kind of critiqued him, like, what do you want to do that for? That's his brother became a physicist, and his dad was the leading psychiatrist in Germany and stuff. So what do you want to do that for? But there's 8 different decisions along the way. And what I try to bring out there is, yes, the courage, but also this is a real human being trying to find his way. Brilliant human being, obviously, but still a real human being trying to find his way. And I think that's actually we're all trying to find our way.
Yeah, all said and done. Said that. I mean, did I understand you say that we should accede our responsibility or cede our responsibilities as adults and let the young people take over this world? Do you know what's happening in the college campuses in the United States? The rise of anti-Semitism is not only in Germany now, it's all over the world. Maybe, if anything, the Germans are more of an ally of the Jews now after what happened. The rest of the world is totally against the Jews. In this country, well, we're seeing a repeat of history right now. And to say that we should give abortion is on the rise. Transsexuality is insane, and we're going to give this generation the responsibility of taking over for where we may be failing as adults. I don't buy that.
No. So what I was saying is,
thank you.
You don't. This again, what I lifted up specifically was on the ecological.
Well, I don't. That's
and you may not agree with that.
Well,
but I was saying that, on that issue, the young people. So, for example, we had kids going out on strike. They just want the issue to be taken seriously.
Well, where does Greta Thunberg, an 18-year-old ignoramus, know about ecology? Hang on, folks. Where do these young people know anything about the ecology of the world? I have a theory about summer is hot, winter is cold. I'm not turning over my ability to reason as a person that younger people should say that the world is heating up.
And I've had 6 kids, so I'm not saying just listen to kids and give them a blank check. That's not what I'm saying.
I hope not.
But what I am saying on the ecological issue, what I've seen is they're willing, they sense it, they're thinking about where things are going to be 10, 20, 30 years down the line. So, and you may just not agree with me.
But we all think that way. They're not the only ones who think that the world.
I'm talking about actually taking the action to address it. And it may be that on certain things, I'm not saying everything or a blank check, but I think on this particular issue, what I have noticed is there seems to be, I'm talking about myself here.
What does that have to do with Bonhoeffer? He wasn't an ecological guru.
That's what I said. He was not.
Yeah, but
because that wasn't his that wasn't an issue before him at that point.
What makes the young people today think that they're ecological gurus?
I don't want to say all young, it's actually 11. Then,
If anybody, that's be great, if anybody needs a, outline or, the, file, please let me know, and I will make sure that you can get a copy, and there are some questions.
all right, appreciate your comment. I just want.
I'm not trying to argue with you, I'm trying to present my
Oh, argue. So we'll meet back in 10 minutes.